You're listening to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Rachel Land. This podcast brings you information and resources to enhance the therapeutic effects of your practice based on a deeper understanding of anatomy, physiology, and the integration of modern science and research with traditional practices and experiences. Join me and my co-hosts Tiffany Cruikshank and Katya Bach as we dive into all things yoga, research, and wellness.
The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.
Well, hello, Alice. Welcome to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. Thank you so much for making time for us today.
Hi, Rachel. It's such a pleasure to be here as well. Thank you for inviting me on.
I feel like we've just snuck an excuse to chat, really. I mean, we're recording a podcast. I promise people it will be beneficial, but really it's just an excuse to catch up, isn't it?
Yeah, it is good to see you once again. It's been a long time, Rachel.
It has been. And the topic for the discussion today is stronger after injury. And I feel like if people just took a cursory glance at your Instagram, as many people seem to do, don't read the captions, just look at the pictures, they might wonder what you have to contribute to this topic because, you know, you're young and you're fit and you're strong and you're able-bodied and you're flexible. What would you know about living with pain and managing injury and recovering from surgery? So maybe we start by talking about what your experiences have been with injury and that things might not be as they seem with a cursory glance at Instagram.
Yeah, I think, that is interesting if you're glancing at my Instagram and like you say, if you don't read the captions, I can see how people might wonder why I've got something to say about that. But I guess it comes back to just this idea that you can't always judge a book by its cover, and that really is the case with me. And also, keeping fit, keeping slim, keeping active has been such a fundamental part of my whole life in terms of managing pain and living with injury that, I am able to do all of these things because it's really essential for me to be able to do them in order for me to be able to live the life that I want. So all of those moves are necessary, really, and helpful for me to be able to do what I want to do.
I love that you started right there by saying it's a necessary prerequisite. It's not that, you just happen to be born this way. This has been what you've needed to do to live the life that brings you joy.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's exactly it. So in terms of my story, I suppose, or this element of my story.
Yeah.
It's a bit of a long one. I was like thinking it through right from the beginning to get to it. I was like thinking it through, writing down some notes because it is a bit muddly. But so just bear with me. But I hope it all makes sense. But I was born with something called hip dysplasia, which anyone who's done their hip module with yoga medicine will be aware of it. But it was undiagnosed when I was a baby. All of my I've got 3 sisters, and they all had hip dysplasia as well, but they were diagnosed, and so they were in harnesses and splints and double nappies and everything like that, as you know, for the first sort of year of their lives. But for some reason, mine was missed. I don't know. Obviously, I don't know why that is, because it turns out that I did have very significant hip dysplasia. So there's still a lot of research going into, does hip dysplasia potentially, can it be unseen when someone's a baby and then it progresses, or the hip doesn't develop into early childhood? Maybe I fell into that category, but for whatever reason, mine was undiagnosed, unlike my sister's. But I was always aware of this term clicky hips as I was growing up. because my sisters had it and I hadn't, or I didn't think, or the diagnosis when I was a baby was that I didn't have it. But it was a language in the household that I was aware of. You know, and then this in turn, for me, for my experience when I was very young and sort of into my early teens, I always had I had very clicky, clonking hips, like audibly loud, clonking hips. And I think although my hips weren't painful when I was growing up, especially when I was little, I I just sort of knew deep down that I had clicky hips. And
Mm.
I remember I would say to my mum, "Oh, mum, I think I've got clicky hips," you know, sort of not really knowing what it meant, but just having this instinct that it was something that I had. And she would say to me, "No, you had the diagnosis when you were a baby. We checked it out because obviously your sisters were all diagnosed with it, but no, you didn't have it. You're fine." But I did experience like what I now know to be the symptoms of hip dysplasia and clicky or clunky hips. And you know, for an example, when I was little, I could just sleep in frog position. You know, that frog pose,
Knees out
or
wide, front
knees
of the
out wide,
pelvis resting
just
on the
like
floor.
lying flat on the floor, like
Mm.
absolutely flat, sort of major external rotation in the hips, or Upavishta Konasana, I could just like fall into and
Mm.
sort of lie my belly on the floor. It was just like nothing to me. I could just do that so easily, and my hips didn't hurt. So I just, but I was aware I had this something. There was something interesting going on there, and I was aware my sisters all had clicky hips, and that I didn't, but I did have clunking clicky hips. So something inside of me told me that I did have hip dysplasia.
Mm.
Um, so then I did have some other symptoms when I was a teenager of knee pain, but that was put down to growing pains when I went to the doctors about it. But that is, I mean, hip dysplasia is notoriously very challenging to diagnose unless it's caught at birth.
Mm.
Diagnosed at birth, it's very very hard to diagnose it later on until it's, I guess, too late.
Well, maybe we
But
explain to
one
people
of the
what hip dysplasia is so that, people who don't have experience of it or haven't done a hip training have an idea of what they're
so
visualizing.
it's a very shallow hip socket. So where we have the ball and socket of the hip, the for a normal sort of healthy hip, the the socket is really covering the head of the thigh bone, the head of the femur bone. Whereas for me, it was more just like a shallow dish,
Just
I guess.
meeting gently as opposed to
Meeting
being completely encircled. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And instead of being completely encircled. So then what happens? I mean, and also it's about the position of where the hip socket is in the pelvis as well. So if it's sort of lower down or further up, in my case, it was further up. So that sort of teamed up with shallow hip meant that I could sort of just lie in the box splits when I was little, and so I hope that explains what hip dysplasia is.
Mm.
Um, so but when I was growing up, I didn't have any sort of hip pain, but I did get some knee pain when I was a teenager, which is an indication, just side note for anyone who's got a question mark whether they have or a child of theirs has hip dysplasia. If they do start showing knee pain or have experiencing knee pain, it is worth measuring, asking the doctor to measure the depth of their hip socket just to rule out hip dysplasia, because that is a time when you could potentially catch it early as well if they do have the knee pain. But that was missed as well, which is easily done because lots of reasons to be getting knee pain. So so then fast forward to then sort of maybe 15 or so years later, when I was doing the hip module with yoga medicine. And this was for the 500 hours. And we started learning about hip dysplasia. And I instantly, clicky hips. I was like, oh, I
That's
know
me.
this one. This is interesting. I think this is what I have. Anyway, obviously I really tuned in. And we just went over all of the symptoms. And then it was really interesting. We did the tests for the hip. That anyone who's done the hip module will know them, in terms of sort of drawing the knee in towards you and bring the knee across the body, sort of test for any of the symptoms for hip dysplasia. And sure enough, I had all of them, more significantly in my left hip than in my right hip. And so at that point, the symptoms were minimal, but they were there. And it just made me realize, like, okay, I think this is probably what I've got, but still didn't have an official diagnosis of it. But it just kind of confirmed the resolve a bit more in my own mind. So with that knowledge that I learned at that module, I then started to do all the preventative exercises for sort of basically maintaining as much stability as possible in my hips. And
So getting
so
your muscles to do some of the work
yeah,
that the bones would do in people with deeper sockets.
exactly. So I started doing a lot of hip strengthening exercises that we learned on the training, and just feeding those into my daily yoga practice. And so that was like the start of me really modifying my own yoga practice to suit my body's needs on that sort of very specific level. And I would really say that, I mean, I can come to that later, but that shift was what meant that I could hold off from having a hip replacement and the other surgeries that I've had for as long as I did, through doing those exercises, teamed with the myofascial release that I learned as well, for releasing excessive tension in the hips as well.
I saw a post on Instagram where you said that when you eventually did see a doctor and have scans done to have a look at the depth of the socket, the doctor was absolutely stunned that you were upright and walking, and that it was basically
Yeah,
just that muscle strength that was holding your hip joints together.
yeah,
I mean,
it
that's
was.
extraordinary.
It was an interesting way that he, finally, when I finally went to was seen by the right surgeon, which was a bit of a journey to get to in itself. But I saw him, and he conducted the interview. the he conducted the appointment in an interesting way, because he didn't have the X-ray up in front of him. He just asked me questions first, and then did the tests, and then when I sat back down and he got the X-ray up, I could almost see the blood drain from his face, and he just looked at me.
Looked at the
Lifting
X-ray,
her
looked
hand
at you,
up,
looked at the X-ray,
brilliant.
looked at you.
And he was like, he was like, how are you walking?
Mm.
And I at the time I said to him, well, I don't know. These are the only hips I've ever known. But I think really, with hindsight, I know why. Well, one, it is a very gradual change in terms of pain. So I think your pain threshold for that region of the body shifts, because it is so gradual. It's not an instantly painful thing that happens. So I think it's a mixture of that, but also I was very diligent with all of the exercises that I'd learned. And I was doing them, really by that point, I was doing them sort of at least once a day, to maintain as much sort of stability as possible in the hips. That meant I could walk without crutches and not have to use a wheelchair, etc.
And I also think we get a lot of messages, we just sort of absorb them through osmosis, that, as soon as you're not 20, well, things will start to change. And I do think a lot of us start to assume, oh, that thing's just me getting older. Oh, that's just, I'm not 21 anymore. Do you know what I mean? And so we can kind of miss things sneaking up on us, because we assume, oh, bodies just change as we get older, which they do. But
Yeah.
Maybe not.
Yeah. And
Maybe not quite that much, and
that,
maybe not by 35, which is when you were diagnosed, weren't you?
yeah. So that is interesting. I think also for me as well, because I, although I felt like this instinct from a young age that I had hip dysplasia, I also, whenever I brought it up with my mum, for example, it was dismissed. It was, I was told like, oh no, you don't have it. We've had that test, and so and I guess you want to believe that as well.
Of course.
Ultimately, and I'm like, well, maybe it's not the case, and maybe my hips are absolutely fine, and maybe if I do these exercises enough, I it will be okay. And I think for a long period, I thought that maybe I would be okay, and that perhaps I could hold off from any sort of um, any surgery, because perhaps I was wrong and I didn't actually have it, because that's what I wanted to believe as well.
Mm. But
Mm.
as it turned out, you did wind up having a surgical intervention, a full hip replacement, and PAO on the other hip.
Yeah, yeah. So by the time I went to have my hip appointment, it was a tricky sort of 3 or 4 years that I had, where I'd say I was quite lost in the NHS system. I would it was like it teamed in the same time as COVID as well, which didn't help the situation. So it was
Mm.
harder to get appointments, and but also, so someone like me who walked into an appointment and seemed absolutely fine, I wasn't necessarily a priority, and I didn't feel like when I went to these appointments, I was really being taken seriously necessarily, and they're quite reluctant to give MRI scans through the NHS, and I really had to fight to have that done, and even then I had sort of certain situations where the MRI scan results were lost, and then I ended up having an appointment with a surgeon who was the wrong surgeon, was a knee surgeon instead of a hip surgeon. So I had this sort of roll-on situation where just small things kept on going wrong, which meant sort of I had to wait another 6 months, another 6 months, another 6 months to be seen. And it ended up then being COVID, and I was like, I absolutely, by this point, my hip pain was really, I just knew it was the time for me to, have the surgery. I couldn't hold off any longer. And so I just ended up just paying to go privately. I'd researched which hip surgeon I wanted to go to. He's Johan Witt. He is brilliant, and he specializes in hip dysplasia and working with hip replacements and periacetabular osteotomies, which is the other surgery that I had. And he specializes in that in young adults and athletes. So I was like, definitely, he's the guy I need to be seeing. But so I managed to see him, and that was November 2020. So really, yeah, during COVID times. And then, like I mentioned before, that the appointment, it was quite interesting and revealing. And then within a month, I had my left hip replacement, had that surgery, and then 6 months after that, so June 2021 was when I had the PAO, the periacetabular osteotomy. Rolls off the tongue.
Yeah, I didn't even. I just went with the letters. It was just so much quicker.
Yeah.
And they're both pretty significant surgeries. The second one in particular, you shared an image of it where your pelvis had been broken, and there were some pretty big screws in place to reposition
Mm.
the socket. Significant surgeries. And you mentioned that the second one in particular was a pretty rocky ride for you emotionally.
Yeah, I think they both surgeries. I mean, the left hip replacement, it's a major surgery, but it's also an uncomplicated surgery. Really, they're
Hmm.
just cutting out.
Out with the old, in with the
Yeah,
new.
out with the old and in with the new, exactly. And 2 hours after that surgery, I was fully weight bearing on both, standing on both feet, and I was doing the physio exercises, and I sort of
Amazing.
went into it with an enthusiasm that I think by the time I'd done the recovery for the left hip replacement, then I had so by sort of the March from the December when I had the surgery, I had a bit of a hiccup in the February where my knee inflamed, which set me back in my recovery a bit. But really by the March, I was back living in London. I mean, it was COVID time, so it was obviously a limited lifestyle anyway, but I was out and about and, I was off crutches and walking around and living a pretty normal life for what was, normal during the pandemic, lockdown times. But I'd say then in the June when I had the PAO, I I was the surgery was harder.
Mm.
So they cut around the hip socket. So they really are cutting through a lot of bone, and they re-angle the hip socket so it covers more of the head of the femur bone, head of the thigh bone. So it
Mm.
seems like the hip socket is deeper than it actually is, and and then they pin it in place. And so it's a preventative measure because the idea is that now with having that surgery done in my right hip, I won't need to have a hip replacement for several years. I'm not sure how long I am being monitored on that. But the longer you can put off having a hip replacement and keeping your bones, it's not that the hip replacement surgery, the first one is problematic, but as I'm 37 now, I will need maybe another one or two more of the same surgery in my life. It does make it harder for your existing bones. So this PAO surgery puts off having to have the hip replacement for a little bit longer, which is helpful in the long run. But that surgery was, yeah, it was a lot harder. I was very sick after the surgery itself. I lost a lot of blood,
Mm.
and so for about a week, I just couldn't lift my head. I couldn't really sit up in bed in hospital without being sick. Honestly, I was very ill, and then trying to stand up, you obviously can't be weight bearing because it is a broken bone that needs to be fixed, and so sort of 20% weight bearing. But I the first time I did that, I fainted. It was very, 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 very painful and very different from the left hip replacement that had happened 6 months earlier. It was uh, I was black and blue and quite sick for a week or so afterwards. And then I came home, and I think just my enthusiasm that I'd had for the first operation, it had petered off by 6 months later.
Of
And
course.
I really just was exhausted with it.
Mm.
And I sort of didn't want to have to force myself to pick myself up and feel positive the whole
Dust
time. I
yourself off, put on a
yeah,
big smile. Yeah, I get it.
you know what? I'm just going to lean into this and,
Yeah. Feel what I'm
just
feeling.
feel what I'm feeling, go through the process, know that it won't last, which it didn't. I healed. I, was able to live life again. But I just approached it in a different way. And I do feel a bit sorry for my, the people who were close by me at that point because I wasn't a joy to be around. But yeah, I got through it.
Yeah. And I think that's really important to share because, we call an episode Stronger After Injury, and you could get the idea that it's going to be uniformly positive. Like it was a setback,
Yeah,
but I came through it stronger than ever. And you have, and you did. But that's not
yeah,
to sugarcoat the darkness that you sometimes encounter along the way. Being injured can suck, being in pain sucks. Healing
Yeah.
takes time. And I think particularly as a yoga student and a yoga teacher, you're also forced to kind of redefine to some extent who you are and what you're capable of. And that's really
Yeah.
tough too.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, so I think that was my experience. I'd had a more positive experience with the left hip and managed
Mm.
to maintain that positive attitude, which wasn't forced. It was like very real, and but with the right hip, I didn't, and I lent into those feelings and experienced it all. And
Mm.
in both circumstances, I've come through it, and
Yeah. And
learned
I
a lot.
think if we rewind a little bit, I met you before you were in significant hip pain, as far as I know, and before you had had a diagnosis of hip dysplasia. But I remember commenting on how controlled and precise your practice was. Like you were obviously already very much focusing on strength and stability and fine tuned control of position. And I remember you explaining that you'd learned a lot from a back injury or a sort of neck and thoracic spine injury that you'd had kite surfing. So even that early experience seemed to have really informed your practice. And as you said, focusing on strength and stability probably gave you an extra several years of life on the hips that you had.
Yeah, it was interesting. I think it all sort of happened at once. I started to rewind earlier when I was talking about when I was in the yoga medicine hip module, and I had that sort of aha moment, like, oh, I
Mm.
think I've got hip dysplasia. It was I was starting to feel the symptoms then, but it wasn't significant. But I did shift my practice to support the hips, and then shortly after that, I had a kite surfing accident and ended up injuring. I had 3 fractures in my thoracic spine, and it was a bit like whiplash, I guess,
Mm.
significant whiplash. And so that, but I mean, I was absolutely fine after it. I mean, the thing is, I went and I had the X-ray, and my spine seized up at the time, and but really, I was walking, thank God, moving,
Mm.
had complete control of my body. So then I went to the doctors to see what they would be able to do about it to help with the back pain. They said to me, "Well, you're fine. We're not going to be doing anything. I'm afraid, like, there's nothing we can do here other than prescribing sort of pain relief." Um, because you're fine. It's going to be something that you have to deal with. And so at that point, I then shifted. I really lent into the yoga practice once again. One, educating through the sort of 500-hour modules. Learning about the body was such an important part. It was a real lifeline at that time for
Mm.
understanding what was going on in my body and how I could then support it, and then shifting my practice. So then, like you've mentioned, and like I've mentioned maybe in the posts and whatnot that you've read, that yeah, it was about building stability and strength and refining my movements. Then I could support support the spine, relieve as much excessive sort of tension as possible with the practice itself. And then I was also adding in the hip stabilizing exercises as well. So
Mm.
I really developed a personal practice that I used to, or I still call, physiyoga. It was just like yoga, but physio exercises. Not very creative, not one that I'm necessarily going to share with all the students, but my practice became very functional. But
But
it
to me,
was,
that's entirely the point of investing all of that time in self awareness and mindfulness and self study is to figure out what do I need? What will help me function in my daily life? So I'm all for physio yoga.
busy yoga, that's exactly it. There's nothing fancy whatsoever, but it was and still is like a daily practice for me that
Mhm.
yeah, going through the parts of the body and just making sure everything's set up for the day ahead, really.
I love
Mm.
that. And I'm already hearing some big themes come through. The first one is that physical strength, joint stability, positional control, body awareness, all of that sort of stuff has been so much more beneficial for you than can I sleep in frog pose? Maybe I'll spend more time there. Can I sleep in box splits? Oh, I'll spend more time there. So shifting your emphasis to real control, coordination, support, and stability. And then the second theme that I'm hearing come through is educating yourself, learning about anatomy, learning about physiology. I think we've all had some experience of battling a health system. Even I have, even though I thought I really did tell myself that, I'm strong, I'm confident, I speak my mind, I'll never have a doctor brush me off, but I have. It's surprisingly easy for that to happen, especially when you look fit and healthy and well and you're not hobbling in on crutches. So
Yeah.
that second part was learning enough to really advocate for yourself, to stand up for yourself and to push back when your instincts are telling you that something's more wrong than
Yeah.
the medical world might think it is.
I think it was about that in terms of being able to have that conversation with the medical world, but more than that, it was about becoming curious about
Mm,
it, really becoming curious about hip dysplasia and understanding what that meant. And the same with the spine as well, understanding the detail. So then I could, yeah, rather than being shifting from really being a victim of the pain, the sensations that I was feeling, to stepping into this real role of inquiry and just
mm,
becoming so curious and interested in what actually does make it better, what actually does, should I be avoiding? And I just found that process in itself very empowering, and it was fundamental for my daily day-to-day mental strength through the process, because it is easy to feel really defeated when
mm.
you're living in pain and exhausted and you're like, oh, I just can't be bothered. But if you really become curious about it, from my experience, that helped so much. And like I say, honestly, especially through the years where the pain became incredibly acute and like towards needing surgery but being lost in the NHS system,
Mm.
I studying with yoga medicine was, honestly, it was like a lifeline for me. And just like examining Muscle Pro and Complete Anatomy and reading all the anatomy books, and it really was, it kept me sane, kept
I
me
can't even
positive.
tell you how much I love that. I think the theme of curiosity has come up in almost every single episode of the podcast and the power that it has. And I love the fact that you talked about it, allowing you to have a conversation with your body and a conversation with pain, as opposed to it hardening you into this victim stance of why is my body doing this to me,
Yeah.
to continue asking questions and investigating and exploring. I love that. So let's shift gears. We talked about the practices that were the most helpful initially to sort of
Mm.
prolong the life of the joint and to give you a feeling of being stronger in your body, those strengthening and stabilizing practices.
Mm.
And you've started to talk about how things changed when you were living in more persistent pain and the importance of curiosity and study as your lifeline. What other kinds of practices were really helpful when you were living in pain?
So I would say something that was really helpful was finding finding someone to speak to
Mm,
about it. I really found that very helpful. I Because it's a very lonely experience when you're living in pain and you don't have a solid diagnosis. There's a lot of question marks next to it, and uncertainty. And so finding an outlet, finding someone who you can speak to, who in my case, I have it's my sister's friend who's also an osteopath who I started to go and see in London, Charlotte Jopling. She was also a bit of a lifeline for me during those really challenging years, when I was in a lot of pain, and I would go and speak to her. And at that point, I didn't have a diagnosis, and she would be there to help relieve the pain. She would be sort of dry needling, sticking needles in to help, and massaging. But also just someone who's got an understanding of incredible understanding of the body, someone who I was able to speak to and have a conversation about and become curious with, and I guess offload a little bit, but also get some really sort of personalized, helpful advice. And she was ultimately the person who's, in sort of my last like 6 weeks or so before I went to have the private consultation with Mr. Witt, she was the one who was like, right, do these exercises, which, side note, were very similar to the ones I'd been doing based on the yoga medicine studies I'd done. I was like, this is brilliant. It's nice to confirm all of that. She was like, do these exercises for 5 weeks, do it daily. And if there's no difference, then you need to go and do this. And so it was good to have that person to speak to, so I wasn't so alone in the process. And so I would definitely say that was fundamental for me, to have that person. And also, and I needed to be better at this at the time, but something I'm better at now, but telling the right people as well. So in the workplace now, for instance, in the school I'm working in at the moment, I've let the executive principal know about my hip situation, my back situation. So then they're aware. And so if I need appointments and if I need to, not walk around so much or whatever it is, there is that understanding and compassion there. And that is also really helpful to tell the right people, so then you've got that support there as well, and to not sort of shy away from doing that, and not ask for help in that way if you're needing it. And certainly that's something that when I didn't have my diagnosis of the hip dysplasia, and I was sort of in this question mark stage where I just didn't do that, and it made things harder actually in hindsight. And so I would definitely say that would be a fundamental thing.
That's really interesting. So not just showing yourself compassion, but making room for other people to show you compassion as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, in a very because that is going to be what enables you to continue living the way you want to live, to have that support for people that you're seeing on a daily basis or regularly around you as well. So there is that compassion there. And then I think as well, for me, it was a lot about finding an escape. So it's all consuming. Anyone who's living with pain will be aware of that. Like, there really is no escape from it. And that's that. But you can sort of lean more into it, and sort of in the yoga practice, in my daily, physiyoga practice, I'm sort of really tuning in and listening to it. But then other points in the day, you need that escape where you're not just tuning into yourself and your pain your whole time. There is that escape too. And so be it with friends who maybe know or maybe just don't know about the situation, the pain that you're experiencing, or be it colleagues or your choice of work, whatever it might be. I mean, I actually laugh about this because I'm a school teacher, and I never thought I would say this, but actually going into the classroom and being amongst school kids teaching Spanish is an escape for me. Like, it takes me out So I know, I love your face. I knew you'd laugh at that, Rachel.
Yep.
But it
Like me
is,
walking into the lion's den. A, don't speak Spanish. B, can't handle children.
well, exactly. But like, it really, for me, like, there's no space
Hmm.
to think about anything else other than the group of 30 kids in front of you. And that for me is, and it continues to be, it was, and it continues to be a great escape from like just uh, like diving too much
Yeah,
into the pain and that being my life.
I love that
Um,
because
mm,
you're more than just your body.
yes, yeah, and also it's a reminder as well. I'll be coming on to this as well as one of the coping strategies of just we can get so involved in our own experience and our own life that it's very helpful, or certainly from my experience, it was really helpful to just be reminded of other people, the world around you, their experiences. And, especially in my circumstance, like the school where I'm working and the school where I was working, is, inner city, London state school. It's, you know, a large percentage of those kids are living under the poverty line and have really tough lives. And I'm hearing about that every single day.
Mm.
And it's just, I just repeat to myself, God, I'm lucky, lucky, lucky. Like, I am so fortunate. And it's just helpful to have that
Mm.
perspective as
And it
part of
gives
the.
you somewhere that you can be of service as well. I mean, there's nothing more therapeutic than knowing that you're actually doing something useful for people.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I would say that's a key part for coping
Mm.
with pain, and both before surgery and after surgery. So an important aspect, especially when I was less mobile, post before surgery as well, when the movement and pain was way more restricted, but also after surgery as well, where I was really just sort of lying in bed and doing very small movements, especially after the second
Mm.
surgery. I dived into the meditation practice and did a lot of. I looked into particular themes in particular that I found most helpful at that time. And one was acceptance. So I particularly, like, when I first got my diagnosis, although I'd had an inkling during my life that I had hip dysplasia undiagnosed, when I then got the official diagnosis, it really sent me into a negative space, being
Mm.
very resentful that it was me and not my sisters, and it was difficult. And I exhausted a fair amount of time trying to find reasons and blame, um, which was it was a horrible time actually as well. And I
Mm.
was kind of looking to point the finger and find reasons, it, and it came to absolutely nothing. It was a futile place to be. And I had to just at that point just be like, oh God, this place of searching for reasons and answers, looking into why, was not helpful, and it was taking me away from what was my actual situation at that
Mm.
point in time. And so really leaning into that theme of just acceptance of, this is where I am, this is my situation, stay present with it and focus on what I can do
Mm.
to make steps forward in the situation, setting out those sort of mini baby steps for progressing and supporting the situation, improving the situation that I was in. And so that was probably the first theme that I really worked on, and I would do a lot of journaling around that and meditation with it. Um, the the next one after that was on self-compassion, compassion. And I think it came from really, we only have a certain amount of time and energy each day. And I was, when you're living in pain, and you've got sort of a gray area around what it is, and what, you maybe don't have a diagnosis or whatever it might be, it exhausts a lot of energy and time. And it takes up, not exhausts a lot of energy and time, but it does take up a
Mm.
lot of energy and time. And it's any energy and time that maybe you would want to be doing other stuff with, but other things in your life fall to the sideline because this has to be a priority. For me, my hips and like managing the back pain were an absolute priority for me. And it did mean that I couldn't do other stuff that maybe I wanted to do. And I got frustrated and annoyed with myself about that. And then when I remembered, actually, no, like, this is the situation, this is what I'm going through, and just showed myself a bit of self compassion and forgave myself for not being exactly where I wanted to be, that calmed my nervous system and also ultimately helped me feel better about my situation, more accepting of my situation, and also make like greater steps forward as well,
Mm.
coming from a more positive place. And so working on that self compassion was fundamental too. Um,
I
and
love that.
then
I mean, you're
yeah,
bringing up such powerful things, and I really appreciate the fact that you're not sugarcoating the process, and you're being really honest about, being in the suck of it all, as Megan Kearney said in her episode. I love it. You've talked about not just the importance of, physical strength and stability, but finding an advocate and somebody that will truly listen to you and offer you informed advice, but maybe even more importantly, just to listen. You've talked
mm,
about the importance of telling the right people so that there's room for them to be compassionate with you.
mm,
You've talked about leaning into service because it can't all be about you exploring your experience and being curious and being mindful, but there needs to be space for you to actually be of use in the world, and that's such a relief from
yeah,
the exhaustion of dealing with pain. You've talked about acceptance, so easy to say, so hard to do.
mhm,
Self-compassion, again, really easy to say, really hard to do. Yeah, you're bringing up such powerful themes.
yeah. Oh well, I mean, yeah, I mean, this is all just when I was preparing for this, recording. I was really thinking back through, gosh, what have I learned from all of this? And
Mm,
so I wanted to be able to share something that was meaningful. So yeah, hopefully that's coming across. Um,
totally.
yeah, I think as well. Also, I mean, it's also going on from the self compassion. I was trying to think of a word that would encompass this next one in terms of a theme for meditation. Maybe you can think of one, Rachel. But
Yeah.
staying focused, no pressure. Um, but staying focused on your own life, like,
Mm.
it can be really easy to just start like comparing to others. I know that's easy anyway, like day to day living, it's a struggle for anyone, whether they're in pain or not. But I think maybe you become more sensitive to it when you're really, you know, in bed and unable to move, or
You
whatever it
mentioned
might
the
be. Or,
loneliness of it all, and it's so
yeah,
natural when we're lonely to be looking, across the valley at the sun on the other side and to think that everything's so different over there and here we are all by ourselves over here.
yeah,
That's such a natural response. I think it does really heighten the natural tendency to compare our worst day to everybody else's
yeah.
imagined, projected best day.
Yeah, exactly. And so that was something that I really had to train myself not to do. And it's also still a work in
Ongoing process.
ongoing process, the not comparing to others, but also not comparing to just your thoughts of what your own life would look like as well,
Mm-hmm.
which I sometimes think is more challenging. You know, see, we often think about like, oh, Instagram, I don't want to compare to others, but actually the main person that I was comparing to was the person I'd imagined. And that was
Mm-hmm.
actually way harder to overcome. You know, it's easy enough to just take Instagram off your phone or whatever it might be, or not see people, but actually nothing, you can't escape from what you imagined for your own life.
Yeah.
And so that was one that I really had to work on, just staying focused on what it is right now and not pining for what could have been or whatever. Um,
Interestingly, I've heard that from somebody in a breakup too, where they broke up with somebody and they were devastated, but they said it was less that they were missing that person and more that they were grieving for the imagined future that they were going to have. You know,
oh, 100%.
all of the stories their subconscious had been telling them for years that they now had to let go of. So that does make
Yeah,
sense. You can't escape your own subconscious programming, can you?
yeah. And I think that's the one that we forget to mention. You know, we often talk about comparing to others, but actually it's the person you imagine for yourself that we have to let go
Mm,
of, and focus on where you're at right now. And I think the main thing that I really learned to do during this period of time of my life that helped and helps me to steer away from those thoughts is just setting like little mini goals for myself, and they could be related to managing hip pain or managing back pain, or you know, learning more about anatomy and physiology, or but it could just be something completely separate as well, but something where you're keeping focused on your own life that is
mhm,
real and right in front of you right now. And that was fundamental for, again, staying in a more positive headspace.
mm.
um, and I think the last one that I wanted to mention, and we've touched on it already, was on gratitude. And again, easier said than done. And I also feel like sometimes it's such a like cliche saying, "Oh, gratitude," because it's one that we always hear and see messages of on Instagram. It's like hard to take it seriously, but I really truly believe that if you come from a place of real self appreciation and gratitude for what you do have,
Mm.
I mean, it does make everything, it puts everything into context and makes everything a lot more manageable. Um, and yeah,
Yeah.
embrace your life. Yeah, exactly as it is. So,
That's such a powerful message. I love that. And I think that's really helpful, even for those of us who aren't dealing with a significant injury or recovering from surgery. These are still the day to day challenges that we all have, you know, to a
yeah,
greater or
yeah,
lesser degree, aren't they?
I think
You,
so. I think that's it. But living in pain just highlighted that basically,
yeah.
and so it is actually helpful for when you're not living in pain either.
You summed it up really beautifully on an Instagram post, which I'm going to read to you because it's one of my favorite things to do in a podcast is just make people squirm as I read their own writing to them, apparently. So you
Thank you.
said, not so long ago, I was questioning if there is still a place for me teaching in the yoga world. I think that's a big reason why I was feeling quite down after my second hip operation. I spent so much time and energy dedicated to the practice, but who wants to learn yoga from a 35-year-old with a left hip replacement and right hip PAO? These were negative thoughts plaguing my mind. But the other day, a new student reached out all the way from Australia asking for online yoga classes to help with her lower back pain. And as someone who has lived with chronic pain due to hip dysplasia and has experienced recovering from major surgeries, this is something that I can help with. Breathing exercises, self massage techniques, and intelligent movement for building a functional balance of strength and flexibility have been my lifeline, helping me live life to the full despite pain. This is my area of expertise. This is what I can share with you all. This is my place in the yoga world right now. And I love that because it really does encapsulate all of the things that you've been sharing so far, that as crap as the journey has been, you've learned so much along the way that you can now, as you have so articulately done today, share with other people. So is there anything that you would like to leave people with? Maybe they are in the midst of having to redefine themselves and looking at a future that's different to the one that they imagined, or maybe they're in the midst of managing an injury or recovering from surgery, or some different challenge. Is there any kind of last advice that you'd want to leave them with?
I think to remember that nothing lasts forever, although it feels like forever at the time. It's helpful to remember that really nothing lasts forever, and that there are things that you can do to support yourself as well. All of what I've mentioned
Mm.
in this episode so far. Um, and don't be afraid to reach out and ask for support from the people around you, your nearest and dearest, and finding some sort of outlet, someone to speak to,
Mm.
is really fundamental for sort of finding clarity and um, helping you to make kind of positive, small or big steps forward in whatever you are going through.
Love that. Thank you. And you are guest teaching on yoga medicine online this month. I believe that your classes have a particular focus on supporting the back, supporting the spine.
Yeah,
Any little
I
tidbits
mean,
that you want to share to get people excited about your classes?
so they're not injury specific at all.
Hmm.
It's about general back care, something that I've really become interested in since my kite surfing accident. And so there's 7 classes that range in length. There's a 15-minute class, which is morning ease your back routine, which is actually the one that I do each morning.
Oh,
I do
physiyoga, people, you can experience it for yourself.
so that's my go-to one that I do each morning. That includes some pranayama as well, which I mean, yeah, is a daily practice for me too. And then there are 3 more sort of functional hatha flow classes. I think they're around 20 or 25 minutes. That are good, just working through the different orientations of movements of the spine. And then there's more sort of an evening class that's sort of easing the back, stretching, like coming into more sort of functional yin yoga poses, and then more restorative and myofascial release practices as well. So all around supporting the back,
Mm.
caring for the back.
Which ideally we would all
Enjoy.
do long before we have a kite surfing accident or are diagnosed with something. Ideally, we would all be taking care of
Well,
our joints.
yeah, well, exactly, exactly. So I think these are for all levels. They're for anyone. You don't need to have something going on in your back to do them. They're designed for anyone to practice.
Great. And I'm sure you've said some things that have really resonated with people listening today. So if they want to find you and learn more about you and what you do, where would you direct them?
So you can reach out to me on Instagram, Alice Louise Yoga. You can also find me on my website, alicelouiseyoga.com. There's details through the contacts that you can email me directly through on there as well. Yeah, they're the main avenues for reaching out.
Fantastic. We'll link to them in the show notes. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today, to talk you through your journey, and at least this part of your journey. I love that you clarified that and didn't make the entire, this is me now. I'm Alice with the hips. Talking us through this part of your journey and sharing some really real advice that I think all of us can benefit from no matter what's going on. So I really appreciate your time. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you for it. Thank you for inviting me on, Rachel. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Yoga Medicine. If you liked the show, be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you got something out of this episode, please spread the word and share it with a friend. You can find more information, articles, trainings, and classes at yogamedicine.com. Check us out on social media as Yoga Medicine, or you can email us at info@yogamedicine.com. Thank you for being part of our Yoga Medicine community.
The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.